The moving truck creaked to a halt on the gravel driveway as the Patterson family stepped out of their car, staring up at their new home. It stood tall and weathered, a Victorian-style house with peeling paint and ivy creeping up its sides. The windows seemed to gaze down at them like hollow eyes, and the front porch sagged slightly under its own weight. "This is it," Mark, the father, announced with forced enthusiasm, patting his wife on the back. Linda gave him a weak smile as she clutched her son Ethan's hand. At 10 years old, Ethan's curious eyes wandered over the house, a mix of fascination and unease flickering across his face. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character, but standing before it now, Linda thought character was putting it mildly. Still, the price had been impossible to pass up. It was their chance to leave the noise and chaos of the city behind and start fresh. As they began unpacking boxes, the house greeted them with creaks and groans, its wooden floorboards protesting their every step. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint scent of mildew and something unplaceable, like damp earth. The previous owners had left behind furniture and knickknacks, giving the place an oddly lived-in feel despite its emptiness. "Mom," Ethan called out from the staircase, "I think someone's upstairs." Linda froze, her heart skipping a beat. Mark quickly ascended the stairs, his steps echoing in the hollow house. He checked the bedrooms and the attic but found no one. "It's just the wind," he assured them, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, as they settled into their respective rooms, the house seemed to come alive. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when he heard it, a faint whisper, soft as a breath, coming from somewhere nearby. He bolted upright, his pulse quickening. "Hello," he whispered back, but no response came. The whispering stopped, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the distant rustle of the wind outside. When Ethan finally fell asleep, he dreamed of shadowy figures moving through the hallways, their voices low and urgent, calling for something he couldn't understand. The first few days in the house passed uneventfully, though the atmosphere remained heavy. Linda spent her mornings unpacking boxes while Mark tackled minor repairs. Ethan, however, began avoiding certain rooms. "I don't like the study," he told his mother one afternoon. "It feels weird." Linda tried to reassure him. "It's just an old house, sweetie. Once we clean it up, it'll feel more like home." But as the days turned into nights, the strange occurrences became harder to dismiss. The whispers grew louder, often at odd hours. They seemed to drift through the walls, their origins impossible to pinpoint. Linda heard them first in the kitchen while washing dishes, a faint, murmuring sound, like a conversation just out of earshot. She turned off the faucet and strained to listen, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it started. Mark dismissed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said. "It's probably just the pipes or the wind." But Linda wasn't so sure. One evening, while exploring the dusty attic, Ethan found a small leather-bound journal tucked inside a trunk. The cover was cracked, and the pages smelled of age. It belonged to a girl named Clara, who had lived in the house decades ago. Her entries started innocently enough, detailing her daily life and chores, but the later pages took a darker turn. "The whispers won't stop. They call to me at night, but I don't understand what they want. Mother says it's all in my head, but I know the house is alive. It's watching us." Ethan shivered as he read the words. The handwriting grew erratic in the final pages, the sentences trailing off into jagged lines. That night, Ethan's dreams returned. This time, he saw the girl from the journal standing at the foot of his bed. Her face was pale, her hair matted, and her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but only the whispers came out. He woke with a start, sweat beading his forehead. The house was silent now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The next morning, Linda found an old photograph in the study. It was black and white, showing a family of 4 standing in front of the house. The father and mother smiled stiffly, while the 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood solemnly. Linda recognized the girl as Clara from the journal. When she showed the photo to Mark, he frowned. "This was probably left by the last owners," he said, brushing it off. But Linda noticed something odd. In the background of the photo, behind the family, was a shadowy figure standing in one of the upstairs windows. Linda couldn't shake the image from her mind, the shadowy figure in the upstairs window, barely noticeable yet impossibly distinct. She decided to dig deeper into the house's history. One afternoon, she visited the local library, leaving Ethan and Mark at home. The librarian, a kindly older woman, lit up when Linda asked about the house. "Oh, the old Hargrove place," she said, lowering her voice. "That house has quite the reputation. Strange happenings. People moving in and out quickly, or disappearing entirely." Linda's pulse quickened. She spent hours combing through dusty records and old newspapers. The house had belonged to the Hargrove family in the 1920s. The father, Edgar Hargrove, was a reclusive man who reportedly practiced strange rituals. His wife and children were said to have vanished under mysterious circumstances. Edgar himself was found dead years later, his body discovered in the basement. The official cause of death was heart failure, but rumors swirled about something more sinister. Back at the house, Ethan was in the study, flipping through Clara's journal again. The whispers had started up, faint but persistent, as if they were coming from the walls. This time, they were clearer, forming fragments of words. "Help us." Ethan dropped the journal and backed away, his heart pounding. The whispers seemed to follow him as he ran to find his father. Mark, busy patching a hole in the kitchen ceiling, dismissed Ethan's panic. "It's your imagination, bud," he said. "This house is old, it creaks and groans like every other old place." But Ethan wasn't convinced. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the whispers grew louder. Linda and Ethan exchanged uneasy glances, while Mark seemed determined to ignore it. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered and went out. In the darkness, a low, guttural moan echoed through the house. Ethan grabbed his mother's arm, his small fingers trembling. "What was that?" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over her racing heartbeat. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "It's just the power," he said, though his voice faltered. "I'll check the breaker box." He made his way to the basement, the old wooden stairs creaking under his weight. The air down there was colder, damp with the scent of earth and decay. As Mark approached the breaker box, the flashlight flickered. He stopped, holding his breath as he felt something, a presence, looming behind him. "Mark?" Linda called from upstairs, her voice distant. The flashlight died. In the pitch-black silence, Mark heard it too, a whisper, unmistakably close. Mark burst out of the basement, his face pale and his breath ragged. There's something down there," he stammered, slamming the door shut behind him. Linda and Ethan stared at him, their unease turning to fear. "What do you mean, something?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But we're not staying here tonight. Pack some things, we'll leave and figure this out tomorrow." But as the family hurried to gather their belongings, the house seemed to rebel. The front door refused to budge, no matter how hard Mark pulled. The windows, though old and fragile-looking, were impossible to break. Even the car keys had vanished from the counter where Mark swore he had left them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They filled every corner of the house, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Linda clutched Ethan tightly, shielding him as shadows began to flicker and dance along the walls. "Why can't we leave?" Linda cried. Ethan, trembling, whispered, "It doesn't want us to." The family retreated to the living room, barricading the door with furniture. Mark armed himself with a fireplace poker, though he felt its uselessness in his shaking hands. Linda held Ethan close as the whispers morphed into guttural groans and sharp, rhythmic knocks that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As the night wore on, Ethan's behavior began to change. He stared at nothing, his face pale and his eyes glassy. "They're trying to tell us something," he murmured. "Ethan?" Linda shook him gently, her voice rising in panic. He turned to her, his expression eerily calm. "They want us to listen. They want us to see." Mark knelt in front of Ethan, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me, son. We're going to get out of here. Don't let this place get in your head." But Ethan only smiled faintly, as if he knew something they didn't. The whispers suddenly coalesced into a single voice, deep and commanding, echoing through the room. "Stay." The furniture rattled violently, and the air grew cold enough to see their breath. The shadowy figures from Ethan's dreams appeared, moving closer, their forms flickering like dying flames. Mark raised the poker, ready to defend his family, but one of the figures lunged at him, sending him sprawling to the ground. Linda screamed, clutching Ethan as the shadows surrounded them. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Ethan whispered, "The journal. It's the key." Linda grabbed Clara's journal from the coffee table, flipping through its pages. Amid the erratic handwriting and smeared ink, a phrase repeated itself in the margins: "Break the cycle." "Break the cycle," she muttered, desperation in her voice. "What does that mean?" Ethan's voice, distant yet firm, replied, "It means we have to finish what they started." Linda clutched the journal tightly, scanning its pages as the shadows pressed closer. The phrase "break the cycle" echoed in her mind, its meaning maddeningly elusive. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, drowning out her frantic thoughts. "Ethan, what do we do?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Ethan's face was eerily calm, his eyes glazed as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "The basement," he said simply. "It started there. It has to end there." Mark's eyes widened. "The basement? Are you out of your mind? We're not going back down there." But Linda placed a hand on Mark's arm. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever this is, it's not going to let us go unless we end it." Reluctantly, Mark led the way, gripping the fireplace poker as they descended the creaking stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the damp scent of earth thickening until it was nearly suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was shrouded in darkness, but the faint glow of the flashlight illuminated strange symbols carved into the walls. A circle of burnt candles lay scattered on the dirt floor, remnants of rituals long past. Ethan moved toward the center of the room, as if drawn by an invisible force. Linda tried to pull him back, but he resisted, his small frame unnaturally strong. "This is where they did it," he whispered. "Where they tried to bind it, but they failed." "What are you talking about?" Mark demanded, his voice cracking. Ethan looked up at his father, his voice taking on a strange, detached tone. "The Hargroves. They tried to trap it here, but it wasn't enough. The cycle keeps repeating because it needs more. More fear. More lives." Linda gasped. "Is that why it won't let us leave?" Ethan nodded. "But we can stop it. We just have to finish what they started." The journal fell open in Linda's hands, its pages fluttering until they stopped on a page filled with instructions written in Clara's shaky handwriting. "Mark the symbols on the walls," she said, pointing. "They match the ones in the journal. We need to complete the circle and burn it." Mark hesitated, his hands trembling as he scraped the dirt floor to clear the broken remnants of the old ritual. Linda hurried to position the candles, following the instructions as best she could. The shadows writhed in the corners of the room, their movements growing more frenzied as the family worked. The whispers turned into guttural screams, shaking the walls and sending a cold, biting wind through the basement. "Hurry!" Linda cried, striking a match to light the first candle. As the circle began to glow faintly, Ethan stood at its center, his body stiff. The shadows surged toward him, their forms coalescing into a monstrous, shifting figure. "No!" Linda screamed, reaching for her son, but Ethan held up a hand. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly, his voice clear and calm. "It has to be me." Mark grabbed Linda before she could step into the circle. "He knows what he's doing," he whispered, his own voice choked with emotion. Ethan closed his eyes, his small hands raised as he began to repeat the final phrase written in the journal: "Break the cycle. Release the hold. Let the house be silent." The shadows screeched in fury, their forms stretching and unraveling as the circle's light grew brighter. Linda and Mark shielded their eyes as a deafening roar filled the room, and then, silence. When Linda opened her eyes, Ethan was lying on the dirt floor, unconscious but breathing. The shadows were gone, the air in the basement warm and still. Mark scooped Ethan into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "Let's get out of here," he said. This time, the stairs didn't creak, and the front door opened without resistance. The Patterson family stood outside the house, breathing in the crisp night air as if tasting freedom for the first time. The oppressive weight that had hung over them since their arrival was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Mark carried Ethan to the car, where Linda wrapped him in a blanket. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Did we do it?" he whispered. Linda kissed his forehead, tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over." Mark started the car, and this time the engine roared to life. As they drove away, the house seemed to watch them from its darkened windows, silent now but no less foreboding. They spent the night in a motel, too exhausted to talk but too shaken to sleep. Linda stayed awake, her thoughts circling back to the journal. Clara's words had saved them, but the memory of her terror lingered like a shadow. The next morning, they returned briefly to retrieve their belongings. The house was quiet, almost serene in the daylight, but Linda couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. For what? She didn't want to know. Mark loaded the last box into the car. "We're never coming back here," he said firmly, his jaw set. As they drove away for the final time, Linda glanced back at the house. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a young girl, watching them leave. But when she blinked, the window was empty. They never spoke of the house again, but the experience left its mark. Ethan, once a carefree boy, grew quieter, his eyes holding a depth that no child should bear. Mark busied himself with work, his hands always trembling slightly. As for Linda, she kept Clara's journal, tucking it away in the back of a closet. Some nights, she would pull it out and run her fingers over its cracked cover, wondering if she should destroy it, or if the story within needed to be told. The Hargrove house remains empty to this day. Locals say it's cursed, that no one stays for long. Yet, every so often, a curious soul ventures inside, drawn by whispers they swear are only the wind. And the cycle begins anew.